Stand on this riverbank 2,300 years ago, and you would not recognize a single stone of what is coming. No iron tower piercing the sky, no golden dome, no wide avenues lit by gas lamps at midnight, just a marsh, a muddy island, a handful of wooden huts, and a tribe that had no idea they were about to give birth to one of the most powerful cities the world would ever know. This is the story of how a swamp became a capital, how a capital became an empire's beating heart, and how that heart kept beating through plague, fire, revolution, and war, until it became the city we call Paris. Every great city hides its beginning. Rome hides its founding legend, Cairo hides its floodplain, and Paris hides a swamp. Long before the Eiffel Tower, before the Louvre, before a single cafe spilled light onto a cobblestone street, there was only the river. The Seine curled through a wide, marshy valley, slow and silver, cutting the land into low hills and soggy floodplains. Reeds grew thick along its banks, herons stalked the shallows, and somewhere in the middle of that river sat a small island, barely large enough to matter. An island that would one day carry the weight of a nation. This is where our story begins. Not with kings, not with cathedrals, with mud, water, and a tribe called the Parisii. Over the next 20 minutes, you will watch this patch of riverbank survive Roman conquest, barbarian invasion, plague, siege, revolution, and 2 world wars, and somehow, against every possible ending, come out the other side as one of the most recognized skylines on Earth. Stay with me, because the story of Paris is the story of a city that refuses to die. Around 300 BC, a Celtic tribe pushes their boats up the Seine and decides to stay. They call themselves the Parisii. They are not the first people to live in this valley. Hunters and fishers had crossed this land for thousands of years before them. But the Parisii are the ones who leave their mark. They settle on the island in the river, the one we now call the Ile de la Cité, because an island means safety. Water on every side, a natural moat against raiders who might come from the forests beyond. Picture their world: round wooden huts with thatched roofs, smoke curling up from cooking fires, wattle and daub walls holding back the damp river air, fishermen paddling dugout canoes low across the current, nets trailing behind them, traders moving along the water, exchanging pottery, salt, and metal goods with tribes upriver and down. The Parisii mint their own gold coins, a detail that tells us something important. This is not a forgotten backwater. This is a tribe with wealth, with trade routes, with ambition. But ambition on the Seine is about to collide with the largest military machine the ancient world has ever produced. Far to the south, a Roman general named Julius Caesar is carving his way through Gaul, tribe by tribe, river by river. And in 52 BC, his lieutenant Titus Labienus turns his legions north toward the marshy island of the Parisii. The tribe does not surrender quietly. According to Roman accounts, the Parisii burn their own settlement rather than let it fall into Roman hands. Smoke rising off the island, timbers collapsing into the river, a people choosing destruction over submission. It is a devastating loss. And it is also, strangely, a beginning. Because where the Parisii fell, Rome would build something far larger. And the name of that small, defiant tribe would outlive the empire that conquered them. The Romans do not abandon this stretch of river. They see what the Parisii saw first: an island fortress, a river crossing, a gateway between north and south. They name their new settlement Lutetia, likely from a word meaning marsh or mud. Even the Romans, master builders of the ancient world, cannot escape what this land really is underneath: But Rome does what Rome always does. It drains, it paves, it builds. Picture it rising over the next century. A wooden bridge, then a stone one, connecting the island to the left bank of the river. Streets laid out in the disciplined Roman grid, running north to south, along what is now the Rue Saint-Jacques. An amphitheater carved into the hillside, capable of holding thousands, where crowds roar for gladiator fights and theatrical spectacles. Public baths with heated floors, where citizens gather to gossip, bathe, and debate. Climb the hill on the left bank, the one the Romans call Mons Lucatius, what we now call the Latin Quarter and Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, and you find temples dedicated to Roman gods, a forum lined with columns, the administrative heartbeat of a growing provincial town. Lutetia is never one of Rome's great cities. It is modest, practical, a useful stop between larger, wealthier centers. But it thrives quietly for centuries, its population swelling into the thousands, its bathhouses steaming, its markets full of wine jars shipped up from the Mediterranean. Then the empire that built it begins to rot from within. By the 3rd century, Rome's borders are bleeding. Germanic tribes press against the frontier. Emperors rise and fall in rapid, bloody succession. And Lutetia, this quiet river town, finds itself uncomfortably close to a crumbling edge. Attacks come. The city contracts in fear, retreating back onto the safety of its island, throwing up defensive walls made from the recycled stones of its own monuments. A haunting image, a city cannibalizing its own temples to survive. And somewhere in this uncertain, dangerous century, the town quietly changes its name. Lutetia becomes Parisii, a tribute to the tribe that once burned rather than surrendered. Paris is born, though almost no one alive yet knows what that name will one day mean. The 5th century arrives like a slow-motion catastrophe. Rome's grip on Gaul is failing. Legions withdraw. Roman roads that once carried soldiers and grain now carry refugees and raiders. And out of the chaos, a new kind of danger approaches Paris, not from the south this time, but rolling in from the east. Attila the Hun. His armies sweep across Gaul, and terror spreads ahead of them like floodwater. In Paris, the people prepare to flee. But one woman refuses. Her name is Geneviève, and according to legend, she convinces the terrified citizens of Paris to stay, to pray, to trust that the city will be spared. And when Attila's forces turn away from Paris toward other targets, the city that stayed is saved. Geneviève becomes a legend. She will one day become the patron saint of Paris, a woman who, armed with nothing but conviction, is credited with saving a city from the most feared warlord in the ancient world. But Rome itself cannot be saved. By 476, the Western Roman Empire collapses entirely. And into that power vacuum steps a new people, the Franks. Their king, Clovis, converts to Christianity, and, in the early 6th century, makes a decision that will echo for the next 1,500 years. He chooses Paris as his capital. For the first time, this river town, once a Celtic refuge, once a Roman backwater, becomes the seat of a king. Clovis is buried here. Churches rise where temples once stood. The island city, battered and rebuilt so many times already, begins to carry a new kind of weight, political power. But the Franks are not yet a unified nation, and their kingdom fractures generation after generation, divided among heirs, reunited by conquest, divided again. Paris, for now, is important, but it is not yet supreme. Other cities compete for royal attention. The crown moves. The story of France itself is still being written, chapter by uncertain chapter. And soon, a new threat will arrive by water, the same water that once made this island safe. Picture dawn breaking over the Seine in the 9th century. Fog clings to the water. And out of that fog, long ships emerge. Dragon-headed prows cutting silently through the mist, oars dipping in perfect, terrifying rhythm. The Vikings have found Paris. Longboats mean the river is no longer just a source of trade and safety. It is now a highway straight into the heart of the kingdom. Norse raiders sail up the Seine again and again through the 9th century, burning monasteries, plundering villages, striking fear into a population that thought their island city was untouchable. In 885, the Vikings return with their largest force yet, reportedly tens of thousands of warriors and hundreds of ships, stretching for miles along the river. Paris, still centered on its fortified island, faces a siege that will last nearly a full year. Picture it. The defenders on the walls, exhausted, watching Norse warriors attempt to storm the bridges again and again. Boiling oil poured from the ramparts, arrows darkening the sky. A city that refuses, once again, to fall. The Siege of Paris becomes legendary, a moment where a relatively small, determined garrison holds off one of the largest Viking forces ever assembled in Western Europe. The city survives, and in surviving, it proves something crucial. Paris is no longer just a convenient river crossing. It is a fortress capable of withstanding the worst that the age can throw at it. That reputation matters, because in 987, the nobles of the fractured Frankish kingdom elect a new king, Hugh Capet, and his dynasty will root itself firmly in Paris. The Capetian kings are about to turn this battered survivor of a city into something the world has never quite seen before. The next 3 centuries transform Paris almost beyond recognition. Population surges. Wooden huts give way to stone houses crowded along narrow, winding streets. The smell of the city changes too. Wood smoke, unwashed bodies, roasting meat from market stalls, the tang of the river, the stench of open gutters running down the center of every lane. This is medieval Paris at its loudest and most alive. On the Ile de la Cité, construction begins in 1163 on something unlike anything built before in the city's history. A cathedral so ambitious that it will take nearly 200 years to complete. Notre-Dame de Paris rises stone by stone, its flying buttresses an engineering marvel, its rose windows filtering colored light onto the faces of the faithful below. Imagine standing in the square as the first sections rise, scaffolding climbing higher than any building the city has ever seen, stonemasons and glaziers working generation after generation on a project none of them will live to see finished. Just across the river, on the left bank, another revolution is happening, quieter, but just as world-changing. Students, thousands of them, flooding into Paris from across Europe, drawn by teachers and scholars gathering along the narrow streets of what will become the Latin Quarter. So named because Latin is the only language allowed in its lecture halls. By the early 13th century, this loose community of students and masters formally becomes the University of Paris, one of the very first universities in the Western world. Theologians, philosophers, and future king's advisors are trained in these cramped, candlelit halls. Ideas move through Paris now, as fast as goods once did. Meanwhile, on the right bank, commerce explodes. Merchants build warehouses along the river. Guilds form, controlling everything from bread to leather to gold. Markets sprawl through the streets, a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, braying animals, and the constant clatter of cartwheels on stone. King Philip Augustus, ruling in the late 1100s and early 1200s, looks at his sprawling, unprotected capital and makes a decision that will define its shape for centuries. He orders the construction of a massive defensive wall, encircling both banks of the river, punctuated by towers and gates. At its western edge, he builds a formidable fortress to guard against English attack, a structure called the Louvre. Yes, that Louvre. Not yet a palace of glass pyramids and priceless paintings, a blunt, square fortress of stone, built purely for war. By 1300, Paris is arguably the largest city in Western Europe, a tangled, overcrowded, brilliant, filthy marvel of medieval life. But the 14th century is about to bring a horror that no wall can keep out. In 1348, something arrives in Paris that no army, no siege, no fortress wall can stop: the Black Death. It moves through the crowded, filthy streets with terrifying speed, carried on fleas, on rats, on the very closeness that makes a medieval city thrive, suddenly becoming its greatest weakness. Picture the horror of it. Church bells tolling almost constantly for the dead. Mass graves dug on the outskirts of the city, filled faster than they can be covered. Physicians in beaked masks stuffed with herbs. Walking streets gone eerily quiet except for cries of grief. Historians estimate that within a few brutal years, Paris loses a significant portion of its population. Some estimates suggest as much as a third to half of its people, though exact numbers from this chaotic era are difficult to pin down. And as if plague were not enough, war arrives too. The 100 Years' War between France and England grinds on for generations, and Paris finds itself caught directly in the crossfire, occupied, contested, fought over by rival factions of the French nobility and English invaders alike. In 1420, English forces actually occupy Paris, and for over a decade, the city that had crowned French kings finds itself under a foreign flag. Then, in one of history's most extraordinary turns, a teenage peasant girl named Joan of Arc leads French forces in a campaign to reclaim the kingdom. In 1429, she attempts to retake Paris itself, an assault that ultimately fails, and she is wounded outside the city walls. She will be captured, tried, and executed just 2 years later. But her legacy outlives the failed siege. Her campaign reignites French resistance, and within decades, English forces are finally pushed out of Paris for good. By the mid-1400s, the city that has survived Huns, Vikings, plague, and occupation begins, once again, to rebuild. It has become almost a pattern by now, a rhythm baked into the very stones of the place. Paris breaks. Paris rebuilds. Paris rises taller than before, and the next rise is about to be spectacular. 1450 AD to 1650 AD. The late 15th and 16th centuries bring a flood of new wealth, new art, and new ideas pouring into Paris from across Europe. French kings, dazzled by the artistic explosion happening in Italy, bring that same energy home. The old medieval fortress of the Louvre begins its transformation. Francis I tears down its grim keep and starts turning it into a Renaissance palace, a home for art and royal splendor rather than war. Painters, sculptors, and architects flood into the city. Printing presses hum in workshops, spreading books and ideas faster than ever before. Paris becomes not just a political capital, but a cultural one. A city where the wealthy build elegant townhouses, where fashion and philosophy circulate through salons and courtyards. But beneath the glittering surface, a dangerous fracture is spreading through French society. The Protestant Reformation reaches France, and the kingdom splits violently between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. Tension simmers for decades, and then, in August of 1572, it explodes into one of the darkest nights in the city's long history. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Picture Paris in those hours. Church bells, ringing not in celebration, but as a signal. Torches, moving through narrow streets at night, mobs dragging Protestant families from their homes. Historians estimate thousands are killed in Paris alone over the following days, with violence spreading to other cities across France. The Seine itself, witnesses claim, runs red near the bridges. It is a wound that will take generations to heal. And yet, somehow, the city endures. Because by now, endurance is simply what Paris does. By the early 1600s, a new king, Henry IV, works to heal the religious divide and rebuild the city's confidence. He commissions the Pont Neuf, the New Bridge, still standing today as one of the oldest bridges across the Seine, and he creates the Place des Vosges, an elegant square of matching brick townhouses that becomes a symbol of a city determined to look forward rather than back. Paris, scarred but unbroken, is about to enter an age of almost unimaginable grandeur, 1650 AD to 1789 AD. In 1661, a young king named Louis XIV takes full control of France, and he makes a decision that stuns the capital. He does not want to live in Paris. Haunted by memories of a childhood uprising that once forced the royal family to flee the city, Louis pours the kingdom's wealth, instead, into a palace outside the capital, Versailles, transforming a modest hunting lodge into the most opulent royal residence Europe has ever seen. For the next century, the court, the power, the glittering center of French political life relocates just outside Paris's gates. But strip away the king, and Paris does not fade. If anything, it grows louder, denser, and more intellectually explosive. Picture the streets of 18th century Paris. Grand aristocratic townhouses standing shoulder to shoulder with cramped, overcrowded tenements. Café culture blooming on nearly every corner, where writers, philosophers, and revolutionaries argue for hours over coffee and wine. This is the age of the Enlightenment, and Paris becomes its beating intellectual heart, home to thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot, whose ideas about liberty, reason, and the rights of ordinary people spread through salons, pamphlets, and coffeehouses like wildfire. Meanwhile, the gap between the glittering wealth of the aristocracy and the desperate poverty of the working poor grows wider every year. Bread prices rise, winters grow harsher. In the narrow, crowded streets beyond the grand boulevards, resentment builds like pressure behind a dam. By the summer of 1789, that dam is about to break, and Paris is about to become the stage for one of the most consequential events in human history. 1789 AD to 1799 AD. On the morning of July 14th, 1789, a crowd gathers in the streets of Paris, angry, armed, and desperate. Their target, the Bastille, a towering medieval fortress used as a royal prison, a symbol of the monarchy's absolute power over its own people. Picture the chaos of that day. Gun smoke drifting over cobblestones, the roar of a crowd that has stopped asking and started taking. By afternoon, the Bastille falls, its governor dragged through the streets, its ancient stones soon torn down piece by piece, sold as souvenirs of a world being violently remade. The French Revolution has begun, and Paris is its epicenter. Over the next several years, the city becomes a stage for extraordinary, terrifying transformation. The monarchy is abolished. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette are tried and executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde, their deaths watched by roaring crowds who once knelt before kings. Then comes the Reign of Terror, a period where revolutionary leaders, gripped by paranoia and ideological fervor, send thousands to the guillotine in the name of protecting the revolution itself. Picture the blade falling again and again in public squares, the crowd's cheers mixing with the silence of the condemned. It is one of the most violent, chaotic periods in the city's long history. A moment where Paris doesn't just witness history, it detonates it, sending shockwaves of revolutionary ideas about liberty and equality across the entire world. Out of this chaos, a new figure begins to rise, a young military officer whose ambition will soon reshape not just Paris, but the map of Europe itself. 1799 AD to 1815 AD. By 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seizes power, and within a few short years, crowns himself Emperor of the French inside Notre-Dame Cathedral, the same cathedral whose stones had risen slowly, patiently, 600 years earlier. Napoleon looks at Paris and sees a capital that must reflect the glory of his new empire. He commissions grand monuments to celebrate military triumph. The Arc de Triomphe begins rising, a monumental tribute to his armies, though it will not be completed for decades. He straightens streets, improves the city's water supply, and begins reshaping Paris into a stage worthy of imperial ambition. But empires built on conquest carry the seeds of their own collapse. Napoleon's relentless military campaigns eventually overextend his forces, and after catastrophic losses, most infamously his disastrous invasion of Russia, his empire crumbles. In 1814, and again in 1815, foreign armies occupy Paris itself, a humiliating reversal for a city that had so recently dreamed of ruling the world. Napoleon is exiled, the monarchy briefly returns, and Paris, still scarred, still rebuilding, enters a turbulent new century, one that will bring not just political upheaval, but a physical transformation more radical than anything the city has experienced since the Romans first laid out their grid of streets, 1850 AD to 1870 AD. By the mid-1800s, Old Paris is a maze. Narrow medieval streets, cramped and dark, choked with disease, nearly impossible to navigate, and, as recent uprisings have proven again and again, dangerously easy to barricade against royal authority. Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the original Napoleon, decides the city needs more than reform. It needs reinvention. He appoints a ruthless, visionary administrator named Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann, and together they launch one of the most ambitious urban transformation projects in human history. Picture it happening in real time across 2 decades. Entire neighborhoods of medieval Paris are demolished, narrow alleys torn open into wide, straight boulevards, designed for light, for movement, and, not so subtly, for troops to move quickly and cannons to fire clear lines if rebellion ever rose again. Elegant apartment buildings rise along these new avenues, all built to a uniform height, uniform cream-colored stone, wrought iron balconies catching the afternoon light, the architectural style that, to this day, is instantly recognizable as unmistakably Parisian. New parks bloom across the city. A modern sewer system snakes beneath the streets, finally taming centuries of disease and filth. Gas lamps line the new boulevards, and as evening falls, Paris begins to earn a nickname that will stick for generations: the City of Light. By the time Haussmann's renovations wind down, the tangled medieval city that had grown organically since the Middle Ages is gone. In its place stands the wide, boulevarded, golden-stoned Paris that tourists still photograph today. But the city is not finished proving itself yet. One more explosive century is coming, of art, of war, of unimaginable darkness, and of astonishing resilience. 1870 AD to 1914. AD, after a brutal, humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and a violent, short-lived uprising known as the Paris Commune that leaves parts of the city in flames, Paris does what it has always done. It rebuilds. And this time, it doesn't just recover. It dazzles. The following decades become known as the Belle Époque, the beautiful era, a period of dazzling artistic and technological explosion. Picture wide boulevards filled with horse-drawn carriages, and soon, some of the world's first automobiles. Cafes spilling light onto sidewalks late into the night. Painters like Monet, Renoir, and Degas, capturing the shifting light of the city in radical new styles that the world will come to call Impressionism. In 1889, to celebrate the centennial of the Revolution, engineer Gustave Eiffel unveils a soaring iron tower for the World's Fair, a structure so radically modern, so shockingly different from anything else on the Paris skyline, that many prominent artists and writers publicly protested as an eyesore, a scar on the elegant city Haussmann had built. They demand it be torn down after the fair ends. It is not torn down. It stays. And within a generation, the tower that Paris almost rejected becomes the single most recognizable symbol of the city, and one of the most photographed structures on Earth. By the early 1900s, Paris is a global magnet for artists, writers, and dreamers, a city where the modern world seems to be inventing itself in real time. Then, in the summer of 1914, that golden, glittering era comes to a sudden and violent halt. 1914 AD to 1945. AD. World War I brings the sound of distant artillery, close enough to rattle windows in Paris. German forces advance perilously near the capital in 1914, and for a tense stretch, the fall of the city seems horrifyingly possible. French troops are famously rushed to the front lines aboard requisitioned Paris taxicabs, and the line holds. Paris survives the war, but the peace that follows will not last a generation. In June of 1940, Nazi Germany's forces break through French defenses with terrifying speed. Paris is declared an open city to spare it from destruction, and on June 14th, German soldiers march down the Champs-Élysées, a swastika flag raised over the Eiffel Tower itself. Picture the silence of those years. Curfews, rationing, neighbors disappearing in the night. The Nazi occupation transforms the City of Light into a city holding its breath, its cafes still open, its boulevards still beautiful, but under the constant, crushing weight of fear. For 4 years, Paris endures under occupation, while a resistance movement works in the shadows, smuggling messages, sabotaging supply lines, waiting for a chance that seems, for years, impossibly far away. Then, in August of 1944, that chance arrives. As Allied forces push across France following the D-Day landings, the Paris resistance rises up in open revolt against the occupying garrison. Barricades go up in the streets once again, echoes of revolutions past. French and Allied troops, led by General Leclerc's Free French Division, race toward the capital. On August 25, 1944, Paris is liberated. Picture the scenes that follow: crowds flooding the boulevards, church bells ringing across the city for the first time in years, General Charles de Gaulle walking triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées as an ocean of people cheer through tears. The City of Light had gone dark, and now, against every fear of those occupied years, it was shining again. 1945. AD to 2026. AD. In the decades after liberation, Paris rebuilds not just its buildings, but its identity. The post-war years bring waves of migration and cultural change, transforming the city into an even more diverse, dynamic global capital. Existentialist philosophers debate in left-bank cafes. Fashion houses cement Paris as the undisputed capital of style. Student protests in 1968 fill the boulevards once more, echoing centuries of a city that has never been shy about taking to its own streets. New landmarks rise alongside the old. In 1977, the strikingly modern Centre Pompidou opens, its pipes and escalators worn boldly on the outside like an inside-out building, shocking a city used to Haussmann's uniform elegance. In 1989, a glass pyramid designed by I.M. Pei rises in the courtyard of the Louvre, a startling, transparent, modern shape, standing directly beside the old fortress walls that Philip Augustus built nearly 800 years earlier. Layer upon layer, century upon century. Nothing in Paris is ever fully erased. It is simply built beside and on top of everything that came before. The 21st century brings its own trials. Terror attacks in 2015 shake the city to its core, striking at the heart of its café culture and public life. And Paris, once again, gathers, grieves, and refuses to be broken. In April 2019, the world watches in horror as flames tear through the roof of Notre-Dame Cathedral, its spire collapsing on live television. 850 years of history, seemingly at risk of turning to ash. And yet, true to form, the city rebuilds. Restoration work moves forward with astonishing speed and craftsmanship. And in December 2024, Notre-Dame reopens its doors, its stone bright, its bells ringing once more over the island, where this entire story began. In the summer of 2024, the world turns its eyes to Paris once again as the city hosts the Olympic Games, opening ceremonies staged not in a closed stadium, but along the Seine itself. Boats carrying athletes past Notre-Dame, past the Louvre, past 2,000 years of survival, broadcast to billions of people around the globe. Today, in 2026, over 2 million people live within the city itself, with more than 10 million across its wider metropolitan area. Tourists from every corner of the planet walk the same riverbanks where Celtic fishermen once cast their nets, where Roman legionaries once marched, where Vikings once laid siege, where revolutionaries once stormed a prison, where Nazi soldiers once marched and were, in time, driven out. The mud is still there, somewhere, far beneath the stone. Think about everything this small stretch of riverbank has survived. A tribe that burned its own home rather than surrender it. An empire that rose and then collapsed into ruin. Huns who came and were turned away. Vikings who besieged it for a year and failed to break it. A plague that killed nearly half its people. 100 years of war. A massacre in the name of religion. A revolution that shook the entire world. An emperor who rebuilt it in his own image. 2 world wars, one of which brought foreign boots marching down its grandest avenue. And through every single one of those catastrophes, this city did the one thing it has always done, since a handful of Celtic huts first rose from the marsh. It rebuilt, taller, stronger, more beautiful than before. Paris was never supposed to become one of the most powerful cities on earth. It began as a swamp. It became a fortress. It became a battlefield, a graveyard, a stage for revolution. And somehow, through it all, it became the City of Light. If you stood on that riverbank today, 23 centuries after the Parisii first arrived, you would see none of the mud, none of the smoke, none of the blood that once soaked these streets. You would see cathedral spires and iron towers, glass pyramids beside medieval fortress walls, and millions of lives layered one on top of another like sediment in the riverbed itself. The city survived because it never stopped becoming something new. If this journey through the rise of Paris kept you hooked until the very last second, make sure you subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering the hidden histories of the world's greatest cities. And drop a comment below. Which city or civilization should we bring back to life next?